Are we running out of missiles? The attacks on Iranian forces and leadership have had a devastating impact on the regime, but the repeated salvos of precision-guided munitions, or PGMs, and interceptors have put a strain on U.S. and Israeli stores of some of these munitions. While the United States retains significant capacity, the expenditures do create risk, particularly in other potential theaters of action, such as East Asia. After previous shortages in munitions and missiles caused by expenditures of U.S. and allied stockpiles in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as in support of Israel, there have been clarion calls for and funding appropriated to address these shortfalls. Why are we in this predicament again? There is no single reason for this situation, and there's no simple way out of it. While building magazine depth in many of the exquisite munitions our military forces use is critical, it is equally critical to build magazine breadth by developing and deploying a wide variety of munitions to meet security threats across the spectrum. Here with me today to discuss how to develop this robust high-low mix of munitions is my colleague Dr. Tom Karako, Director of the Missile Defense Program here at CSIS. I'm your host, Jerry McGinn, and welcome back to a special release episode of All About the Base. Welcome, Tom. It's great to have you.
Hey, great to be on.
Excellent. Now let's look at some headlines from the press recently that talked about, that we are running low on munitions in some ways, and you can see the headlines. But then the president actually released a truth on Friday that said something a little different. That essentially that we're going to quadruple production of the exquisite weapons, but we have enough middle class and other kind of munitions. So what's the reality here? Are we running out of missiles, and what's the balance?
Yeah, well, it's never quite so black and white. I think that the headlines that you had up there just a moment ago really speak to the fact that, as we've said a number of times, missiles have really become weapons of choice. They're the things we reach for early and often in order especially to have standoff capability. We don't like flying American aircraft over Iran, over air defenses, for instance. And so it's that long-range standoff capability that we just use over and over again when we want to go in. The first thing we want to do is to suppress enemy air defenses, that sort of thing. And so there's been a number of statements by the president, by Secretary Hegseth, and by General Kane. And I think the formulation that those officials have given, which is fairly precise, and when asked, do we have enough missiles, the answer is yes, we do for this particular conflict, for this particular operation. But the bigger question, as you said in the opening, is, okay, but what about the next thing? What about having enough actually made, but also fielded in sufficient quantities and sufficient readiness to actually deter shenanigans by China in the Pacific, for instance? I mean, we've kind of moved all of our, or a lot of our forces to the Middle East to deal with Iran, to take care of Iran, to include some of our air defenses from South Korea and Japan, for instance. Mm-hmm. And so it does raise the question, not merely have we built enough and acquired enough, but are they there and ready to go so to have that deterrent purpose? And so in terms of these statements, look, I think that there's a little bit of a posturing going on here in terms of having a virtually unlimited supply. I think that's kind of what the aspiration is, and we're going to talk about kind of the aspiration of the Pentagon to get after this munitions ramp. But I think actually in some respects the headlines point is an important one, and it is one that reflects that there is indeed an urgency here. And I would say in some respects the situation is worse than meets the eye.
So, Tom, this is not a new problem, it seems to me, that we've had, there were headlines in the early supporting of Ukraine, of running out of munitions and so on. So are there some challenges in producing these munitions?
Well, look, these are These are certainly, to some extent, exquisite items. As you said before, they were precision-guided munitions, and so there's some complexity in terms of putting that together. But I would say that the biggest impediment has been the uncertainty principle and the cyclical nature of demand, and really that speaks to frankly, the nature of the customer. And the very back and forth from year to year, big sweeps of we're going to buy a bunch of them this year and then next year we're going to change our mind, for instance. And that really impedes industry from being able to have the workforce, the assembly lines, the long lead materials, that really uncertain, or in some respects, frankly, trickle production rates has not been good for unit cost and all these other things. And we had up here a moment ago reference to this meeting on Friday with the heads of these companies in the White House. Well, that was because there's been an effort over the past year to try to figure this out and try to get to a sustained demand signal on the part of the customer, and the customer being the government. Yes, the Pentagon, but also Congress has to be part of that identity as a customer.
So, Tom, this is really not a new problem. As we talked about in the beginning, we've had challenges on ramping these munitions, and this has been a focus for both the last administration and the current administration. But the current administration has really taken a really aggressive approach. They formed a Munitions Acceleration Council, and then they've established these framework agreements. So if you can bring up the next slide, that really talk about these long-term, and these are 7-year contracts and big deals. I mean, in terms of the amounts of munitions to really significantly ramp these efforts. But these are not contracts per se, correct?
Yeah. Let's talk about how we got here and how we got to this effort. I think it was basically after the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the policy circles in Washington learned a new word, and that word was munitions. And so everybody it's kind of sunk in that, oh my goodness, we're expending, by we I mean the Ukrainians and the Russians especially, are expending a whole lot more of these than we kind of expected. And so over the couple years of the Biden administration, you saw a number of things being ramped, Patriot, Gimlers, and so forth. And now in the Trump administration, what I would say is that effort is continuing, but it is going on steroids. And so over the past year, since about May of last year, especially Deputy Secretary Feinberg has been really, and this was before the 12-day war, mind you, has really been taking industry and kind of shaking them in terms of what are you going to be capable of to max out your production lines. And I would say that effort, that aspiration is exactly right. It is a correct application of the insight of what we've seen in the Ukraine conflict, if we've seen from the 12-day war with Iran and so forth. And this is sort of the beginning of the manifestation of the output. You mentioned the Munitions Acceleration Council. News reports suggest there's been about 12 prioritized munitions that they've been focusing on in different ways. You could probably add to that list, for instance, back to your breadth point, but this is the beginning point of announcements. And you see 5 munitions for Raytheon, and also here Patriot PAC-3 and THAAD referenced as well. But as you said, these are not contracts. These are agreements. These are agreements to agree about a general price per thing, but they have to get onto contract. And here's where I'm getting a little worried, Jerry, because these bids have an expiration date, and you can't put something on contract unless you have the money behind it. Let's go back to January of this year when Congress passed the 2026 appropriations. They had a little line in there that says, oh, by the way, in passing this bill, we are aware that we are $28.8 billion with a B short just in terms of what the Pentagon wants for munitions. Like that should be a little flashing red light in terms of this effort. And so we have some funds, and this is where we get to the one big beautiful bill. There are some funds that will supplement that shortfall from the 26 appropriations, but unfortunately, it's not enough to get this started, to get those 7-year contracts in place, even with the termination and liability caveats. It's not enough to get this in place, and that's worrisome. And so when you add that to the massive numbers of things we expended last summer over the course of a long weekend in the defense of Israel, and then you add to that the yet uncertain but probably very large numbers that we're expending in Iran right now, this is where we ought to get worried. that we are not on track, and we need to get on track like yesterday to get these things started.
Let's briefly talk about the One Big Beautiful Bill that you mentioned. So you see on this next slide, you talk a little bit about the how much of this is designated for munitions.
Yeah, so this is the overall thing, just over $150 billion. And we saw Golden Dome, for instance, 24 billion, and this is 25 billion out of that big chunk that went to munitions. Now there were a handful of other things, Indo-PACOM and such, that had pieces of funding that would qualify in that category. But this is that 25 billion broken out in a little bit more detail. And in terms of production, we actually, a lot of it is going to production capacity and also supply chain. So in other words, some longer term efforts, not just immediate purchasing kind of thing. So that's going to give you some funds to go buy some, to put some PAC-3s on contract, for instance. But again, it's a little bit less than meets the eye in terms of being able to just go procure lots more munitions. And if we go to the next slide, this is where we quantify what was actually in there. So they sent over the spend plan to Congress, I think a couple weeks ago, and the crack research staff of the missile defense team put this together in terms of what was actually there for numbers. And here again, it's a little bit less than meets the eye. So with recertifications as well as new procurement, you're looking at about 300 Tomahawks. Now we haven't seen news reports, but I'll bet we probably could easily have used more than that over the past week. Keep in mind, we've only been buying like 50, 60 Tomahawks a year in recent years, and 57, I think, was the number last year. And you see a handful of other things, JASM, LRASM, small numbers of other things, notably no THAAD money in the One Big Beautiful Bill. So this is a conception of the scale of what's there and also how short this is relative to the ambitions. Again, we produced 650 PAC-3 MSEs last year. They were actually made, and Deputy Secretary Feinberg wants to go to 2,000 a year. Depending on the unit cost, you're looking between 44 and 50 MSEs that were probably there, the money for which was probably there in this bill. So that's kind of the level of shortfall that big appropriation chunk isn't going to get us there.
So we clearly have a lot of ambitions in terms of the amount we want to ramp production, but we also have this challenge that presidents keep using these things, right? we keep they have very low collateral damage. They're very precise. They're very exquisite. So I mean, will we ever have enough? Is a question that comes to mind for me. And you know, even if we ramp it at the scale they're talking about.
Yeah. Well, the question is enough for what? And there is also the onus on the user to use these responsibly. It is a bit of a head scratcher when we see, 1,000+ kilometer range Tomahawks being used, which are good for standoff and they're good for when you don't want to fly over air defenses. But it's a bit of a head scratcher when we use them against the Houthis, for instance, or when we use them against ISIS in Nigeria. Like, it's probably convenient to get there, but because these are scarce national resources, you do have to wonder why use standoff weapons when stand-in weapons are sufficing. And the two most important words I think that General Kane said in his press conference last week is that we were moving, because we got an air superiority, we were moving to a munitions transition. And he said, transitioning from having to use a bunch of standoff, long-range stuff, to stand-in attack capability. In other words, JDAMs and SDBs, small diameter bomb, and that kind of thing. Interestingly enough, there was a press release over the weekend that we were transferring a bunch of munitions to Israel. And if you take a look at that, it actually looks like a lot of bombs. And that's a reflection of the fact that we've gotten air superiority, we don't need to have that standoff capability. This is a situation that existed in the 12-day war last year when we could fly over Iran and bomb with impunity. Bombs are a lot less expensive. We have a lot more of them, so that's a good thing.
You talked about the transition from some of these precision munitions to more small diameter bombs and so on, but there's also been a discussion, as I mentioned in our lead-in, about the need for more breadth of options in our mix of munitions. And so can you talk a little bit about the importance of having that breadth in addition to the depth that we've been discussing?
Yeah, well, this conversation has been going on for a while now, and usually what's discussed there is affordable mass. Lots and lots of cheaper effects that can be had. Now, we talked a minute ago about standoff versus stand-in, and it's a little hard to get. You can go have fast, cheap, and good. You can't have all three, so you have to pick two. And so usually, not always, but usually, there tends to be a kind of a bias towards the shorter range stuff. For instance, cheap. And less capable. And so you've seen a number of, and this is all for the good, kind of the proliferation of ideas for low-cost cruise missiles, for instance. And that's great. That gives a lot of that mass. And so we saw, for instance, the Lucas drone used in Iran, which is, I like to say, a bit of poetic justice. We reverse engineered the Shahed and sent it back to them. And apparently, according to news reports, at a lower per round cost than what the Iranians themselves were producing or the Russians were producing Shaheds at. So that kind of stuff is all for the good. I would also just caveat a bit that we have to have a high-low mix, but don't get lulled into thinking that you can neglect the high part of that. Mm-hmm. And that it is indeed the case we want to get this new family of affordable munitions started, but it's really hard to substitute for the capabilities on the missile defense side or the strike side. Tomahawk is our longest range conventional cruise missile. There's a reason we reach for it. There's a reason why, in the Biden administration or the Trump administration, they send these 60 at a time or more, for instance. Likewise, you can have herds of coyotes and flocks of roadrunners. Those are counter-UAS effectors, and you can throw 500 in the air all at once, and it still won't do what a PAC-2 or PAC-3 missile defense interceptor will do. So I think it's important to caveat that it's really hard to substitute for the high-end stuff. If you want to penetrate enemy airspace, you're not going to be able to do it with a 200-kilometer cruise missile.
That's a great point. But these efforts to build breadth that you started to allude to, like Lucas, the department's drone dominance program, really about kind of building out what they call tradable mass, and this family of affordable mass munitions is really about producibility, about trying to build systems at scale at lower costs. Maybe not quite the level of capabilities of some of our exquisite weapons, but again, building on that portfolio. And another area that is receiving some attention, and I think would both help with breadth and depth, is the whole idea of co-production or second sourcing. And we've seen that with in Poland, where they're building Patriot missiles there, and scaling that and maybe moving into second sourcing in areas like solid rocket motors and the like. What are some thoughts about kind of helping build out the breadth of our munitions portfolio in those kind of areas?
So this I think is a different kind of breadth, and I think this is an important distinction to make. Is it's not just diversity of types for its own sake, but it is diversity of production. So second source, third source. This I think is potentially tremendous, right? And you could in principle go to a build to print and have multiple companies basically building the same thing and looking trying to get after more and more production and capacity above all. Now conversely, sometimes for instance, a company will say, well, look, you can have a bunch of startups, let's just say solid rocket motor producers. You could have 10 companies and they're all producing a couple Mark 72s a year. But as I'd like to say, and this kind of fits with your show, Jerry, to some extent, these experiments in broadening the industrial base and broadening the SRM producers, it feels sometimes like it may not be big enough to matter. And it's more like fiddling with the bass and the treble knobs when what we really need to do is crank the volume dial. And so it may be that you just go to the bigs. So there's basically two big companies right now that produce SRMs. Or it may be that you kind of do a bit of both. And that's kind of on the path that we're on right now. You saw the $1 billion equity stake in L3 is a piece of that. The Biden administration put $216 million into a facility in Camden for L3, formerly Aerojet as well. So I think that there's different kinds of breadth, and it's probably on a munition by munition basis in terms of how you figure out the sweet spot or the knee in the curve. The question is, you can have more entrants, but it really goes down to the second and third tier supply chain. So if they're all coming back to the same producer of a widget, that might be a little bit deceptive in terms of, are you actually broadening it?
Okay. Yeah, I love the reference to our theme of our show, so that's outstanding. So what kind of additional actions does Congress, the Pentagon, and industry need to do? I mean, we've talked, one of the things that is often discussed is like multi-year procurement and encouraging co-production and the like. So what are some things that need to happen in addition to what we've just talked about?
Yeah, well look, both the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act last year, and the 2026 appropriations bills, both of them had multi-year procurement in them. Notably, the NDA had it for more munitions than was in the approps bill, but never mind, there was a high degree of similarity there. So that's one thing, and all of those ambitions for those 7-year contracts, you gotta have that multi-year procurement. Look, these are publicly traded companies. They can't and shouldn't be expected by the customer to stick their neck out and invest, no kidding, double-digit $1 billion to facilitize, to buy long lead items if there's not a high degree of confidence that the customer will be there, in a couple years and not change their mind. But very concretely, again, there was that $29 billion shortfall just for 26, for instance. Very concretely, what that means is there needs to be a munitions supplemental, I believe, to replace what we did last summer, to replace the yet unreported numbers that we're spending right now, but also, and by scale, get to the real concern, which is that munitions ramp. That 7-year plan to go from 650 MSCs to 2,000, to go from 57 Tomahawks to 1,000 a year, and so on. So that's a big hill to climb, and we're not there yet. And that, by the way, is why I think the munitions supplemental, we've heard kind of $50 billion. I think it's probably going to need to be triple-digit billions.
Well, Tom, that really shows that there's a lot to be done on building both depth and breadth in the munitions industrial base. I think the amount of ramping that needs to be done on production is quite ambitious and will take a lot of sustained attention from Congress, industry, and government, as well as in building out different types of munitions to help have a better high-low mix, as well as bringing in new providers to provide second sources of co-production of munitions. So we'll be following these issues as we go forward, and I want to thank everyone for joining us for this special release episode of All About the Base. And remember, it is all about the base.